Welcome back to State of the Nation. This Labour government has revealed its true colours of cronyism. Since 2019, senior Labour politicians now in the Cabinet collectively received nearly £500,000 in campaign donations from the unions. Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, received more than £14,000 in support from unions since 2019. Louise Haigh, the Transport Secretary, has received more than £24,000. The Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, and the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, have received donations too. In fact, of the more than 400 Labour MPs, more than half of them took money, in cash or kind, since the election was called, which totalled nearly £2 million. Now, you may wonder, why does this matter? Political parties take donations from various institutions all the time, and it's surely better that they're funded by outsiders rather than by you, the taxpayer. But since the Labour Party has got into office, what has it been up to since the 4th of July? Well, it's been taking money from Tory voters and giving it to Labour voters, especially in the public sector unions. It began with a heartless scrapping of the winter fuel allowance, something which was received by pensioners and who, of course, disproportionately vote Conservative. But what followed has been a series of inflation-busting pay rises for the unions in the public sector. Teachers and nurses are set to receive a 5.5% pay rise, while prison service workers and senior NHS managers will see their pay increased by 5%. Train drivers have been given a whopping 14% pay rise over 3 years, and the largest by a country mile has been given to the junior doctors, 22%. And remember, inflation is back on target at a little over 2%. So the unions give millions to the Labour Party, which then takes billions from you, the taxpayer, to repay their puppet masters. This is a cynical transaction, a quid pro quo, where the funds from unions are effectively repaid by you 1,000 times over. Ever since Sir Keir Starmer was elected Prime Minister, he has tried to maintain that the grown-ups are back in charge, that the dodgy Tories have been ousted, and that the morally superior Labour Party has been restored to its rightful place. Again and again we hear him say that he is restoring governance as a form of service, but he is merely returning to Labour's old ways. Starmer could happily quote Emmanuel Shinwell, who said, "We know that the organised workers of the country are our friends. As for the rest, they don't matter, a tinker's cuss." As ever, let me know your views, mailmog@gbnews.com. Well, I'm delighted now to be joined by the political commentator, Matthew Stadlen. Matthew, thank you very much for joining me. No one else is worth a tinker's cuss. If you're not a Labour unionist, you're not going to get a look in at all in this government.
Relatives in Oxfordshire, the beautiful county of Oxfordshire, which I think gives your county of Somerset a run for its money. Can we start on a note of agreement and agree that our country is a beautiful place?
We can certainly agree on that. That's a good starting point. And we can then discuss which county is the finest. But let's try and get to the issue around Labour having taken over. If you quote another 1940s cabinet minister, or slightly misquote him, the "we are the masters now" seems to be the approach that is being taken. We're going to back our friends, but if you're not one of our friends, you're not getting a look in.
No, I disagree with that very strongly, Jacob, and not perhaps just because you'd expect me to disagree with you, but because the Conservatives, I would argue, ran the country into the ground, ran public services into the ground over the course of 14 years in power. And what Labour is desperately trying to do, I think so far in a relatively, to use your phrase, grown-up fashion, is to try to get things back up and running. And that includes, of course, the National Health Service, which we, or the vast majority of us, certainly I do, rely on to keep us well, keep us healthy, keep us alive, but also the railways. And as a Conservative, you'll be aware that if you have strike after strike on the national railways, you are going to have an economy that starts to grind to a halt. None of these decisions are easy. And by the way, I have a huge amount of sympathy for those pensioners who are just above that cut-off line, who I think will suffer this winter. And we've heard only today, in fact, that energy prices are going to rise during the autumn, and I would ask the Labour government to look again at that. But this is a false choice, I think, the idea that the Conservatives have been pitting pensioners against train drivers, against people who make our railways work. And I think you know what you're up to there.
I understand why you'd say that, but your point on the pensioners who are just above the pension credit limit is surely absolutely the right one, that of the 10 million pensioners who are going to lose, many of them are in that position. And as you know, by and large, pensioners are more likely to vote Conservative than other age groups. And giving a whopping pay rise to train drivers, who are very well paid anyway, as a consequence of their strike action, is back to the 1970s.
I think it depends, Jacob, on how you look at it. Don't forget, for a start, these train drivers have suffered in their pay, like many of the rest of us, it's absolutely true, in recent years. The cost of living is crippling for people. I experience it myself. I'm relatively fortunate in my life, but last week I had to pay a £1,700 bill for relatively minor car repairs. There are lots of people in this country who really would struggle to pay those sorts of one-off payments. Train drivers are no different. We have to get the country working again. We cannot anymore afford to have strike after strike, because if the economy shrinks, if the economy struggles, if the economy above all doesn't grow, then the pot for all of us, out of which we pay pensioners who, yes, are vulnerable, that pot shrinks. That's basic Conservative economics that I would have thought you'd sign up to.
Yes, of course you've got to try to grow the economy, but if you pay the Danegeld, the Dane doesn't go away. And that showing that unions who strike do really well, and the more aggressively you strike and the more damage you do, the better off you will be, is absolutely the wrong lesson. I mean, the nurses did a deal with the last Conservative government. They went back to work. The junior doctors are now getting more than the nurses got. What lesson does that teach the nurses, that they should be more militant?
Well, I hope that isn't the lesson that it will teach nurses, because like you, Jacob, I believe that nurses go into relatively poorly paid jobs, lots of them, certainly to start with, because they want to do good in society. They want to look after my family, the family of many, many viewers who are watching today. I don't know whether you have private health yourself or not, but I believe in our nurses, and I think it was right that they were paid properly. So you can look at all of these things from two different sides, and I would question your premise at the beginning in your monologue, because you're trying to suggest that Labour, and I think you've been very cynical in this, if I may say so, you're trying to suggest that somehow Labour are in the pockets of these unions and they're trying to reward their mates.
Yes.
I mean, you'd have to get up various secretaries
Matthew,
put that to them in
You're absolutely
person.
right. I'm not trying to suggest this. I'm saying this. It seems to be absolutely clear. And for the record, yes, I do use private health, but the private health sector also employs nurses who get paid similar amounts in the private as in the public sector. Thank you very much, Matthew. But with me now is the State of the Nation flabellum holder and Telegraph columnist and restaurant critic, William Sitwell. If you go on strike in the public sector, you will now get a good pay deal. The train drivers are extremely well paid. Matthew was talking about the cost of living crisis, but actually we know that hits those on the lowest incomes most. It hasn't particularly hit the train drivers.
Yeah, and if you provide these no strings attached pay offers, you're going to find other public sector workers chasing the same pay increases. I think what's very interesting about this Labour government is that in these early weeks of its new administration, it's behaving like a left-wing government.
And in a way, if you're a Conservative supporter or indeed an observer of politics, we haven't seen a kind of left-wing socialist Labour government. I wouldn't think you could even describe the Blair era as that. And so Conservatives, when they talk about the ghoulish aspects of Labour getting in, this is now you see what happens when a Tory government doesn't behave like a Tory government and allows a proper Labour government to get into power.
Well, I think it's very interesting because I think many people thought in July that Keir Starmer was Tony Blair Mark II. And Tony Blair, when he got in, carried on governing essentially as a left-wing Tory rather than as a socialist. Keir Starmer hasn't done this. He has governed as a socialist. And, of course, that's what he stood as. But he implied something rather different, I think, in his election campaign.
He did, but as
We knew during the election campaign, Starmer's Labour would do anything they could do and basically say very little in order to get into power. And, you know, they are doing what socialist governments do. And we say all along, you swell the public sector, you target free enterprise, you're anti-capitalism, and you raise taxes. And this is what's happening. And I think it's good news for Tories because they can regroup and discover what it is that their true value and their true meaning needs to be.
And it may also help us restore trust, because it turns out that what we said to people in the election was true, that you would get a government in the pocket of unions, you would get a left-wing government, which of course with Tony Blair turned out not to be true because he stuck to Tory spending plans for the first couple of years.
yes, I mean,
We are now seeing the ideology come through, and it's very interesting seeing Rachel Reeves, you know, fiddling with the figures in order to come up with this 20 billion black hole. You're not going to get civil servants complaining about it. No one in the Treasury will ever complain about a government who is a tax-raising government because they want revenue in. Every department across Whitehall has been told by their ministers to, you know, find black holes, prepare for tax increases. So it's good news for civil servants. So it's going to take a while, I think, for Tories to really start, you know, on this long march uphill to try and convince people as to the realities of what's happening.
Interestingly, Labour's ratings have already started falling, and I think this isn't surprising because you mentioned Rachel Reeves. What she said about the black hole was simply not credible. All the figures show the UK economy is performing better than almost all of other competitors in comparable nations, and that this suggestion that we're in a terrible state lacks fundamental truthfulness.
I mean, I think there's a general
General feeling across the media that after 14 years of Tory rule, that the press needs to give Labour, you know, a good, sensible honeymoon period in order to be able to actually give it time, you know, show it some respect, allow it to unleash some policies on the country and to govern. But I think that actually post, 28th of October, that first budget, when they nail their true colours to the mast, when you can actually see in black and white the difference between what they promised and what they're delivering, I think the press will start to really go for them. And I think that'll be very interesting to watch.
The great sucking sound of wealth being taken from the private sector and given to their union mates.